All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the BSF Houston Tri-Reg Premium Championship deck profile. My name is Sean. Uh, on Bushy Nav, I'm known as the Hard. This is the medal we got. On the side, it says the Champion Team Houston logo. This is the deck that me and the V Premium player on our team built together. Well, hold on, focus. Okay, so this is the deck that me and the V Premium player on the team, my friend Eugene, built. We worked on this deck for a couple months. We started building it basically because our original deck was supposed to be Riviere. We thought Riviere was really strong. The Superior Ride felt consistent and really powerful, but then the more I tested Riviere, I kept having close games even after getting the Superior Ride going first, and close games that I lost even after getting the Superior Ride going first. And that meant that if I was going to play this like convoluted Superior Ride deck and not get an automatic win when the combo came together, what was I doing, right? Why not just play Highlander at that point, or play something more powerful and consistent? And my natural play style from other card games is something closer to control decks, so it wasn't jiving with me very well. And I really liked Shiranui, and I had some confidence issues about whether I was good enough to play the deck. Because I'm not a super experienced veteran player. I've only been playing this game a couple years. I don't have a decade of premium format experience to draw on like some other players do. Hold on. Yoink. This is my cat. He very mischievous, likes to get in the view of the camera whenever he can. The bane of my existence for webcam testing. So as I was saying, don't have a lot of experience with premium specifically, but I tried to make up for that with lots of testing and practice. And obviously I was successful to a degree. But we started working on Shiranui because these other deck choices weren't jiving with us, and really liked the deck. I found it very enjoyable to play. I like decks that put the opponent in difficult situations where they have to stress out and figure out how to get out of the situation. That's what I played in Magic the Gathering. I like that in Jeweled and Standard, and I like it in this deck at Premium. And the Crest stood out as a really new, powerful addition to the deck. But because there was no data for deck lists with the Crest, there's no list we could copy, at least not until the week before the events. That means we had to do the brunt of the testing and deck building ourselves. So we worked really hard to explore all the possibilities and build a deck that we thought would be successful. And I think we accomplished that. Our build is really different than the other lists on the internet. And when we saw the list go up for London, we did have a brief crisis of faith because they came to the opposite conclusions that we had come to in testing. They were still playing the Guard Restrict package. We believed the Guard Restrict package was no longer good. They were playing the Token Maker instead of Shoujo Doji, and they were cutting down Restanders until they were only playing 3 Grade 2 Restanders and 1 Virina for their Forbidal, which was the opposite impression me and my teammate had reached. We believed we needed to increase the number of Restanders to 6. And if everyone topping in London was playing this version of the deck, maybe we were the morons. Maybe we were the idiots who were we were too deep in the hole with our inbred testing and it wasn't going to work out. But we decided to stick to our guns, and it paid off. Which will get me into the notable omissions from this deck list. You will not see any Mizukaze in this deck. You will not see any Forbidal in this deck. You will not see any of the Token Maker in this deck. You will not see any Rui in this deck. And the reasons for that are that Mizukaze is simply just not good enough anymore. Every deck has access to Quick Shield, Guardian Shield going second, and you can't afford to go second blind in Premium because some decks will destroy you if you do. And you don't know what your opponent's playing until after you've turned up your Vanguards. So you have to go first because that's the safest option, at least in my opinion. If you are really confident in your ability to go second, even against bad matchups, then some of what I'm going to say today is not going to apply to you. But I do believe you should be choosing to go first with this deck. Because of that, every deck is counterplayed to Muzakaze and Rine in a way that negates their effectiveness almost entirely. This means that the guard restrict combo does not lock our opponent and kill them when we need it to. It's unreliable. It doesn't let us steal any wins that we wouldn't get otherwise unless the opponent makes major mistakes, and if your opponent is bad, you are favored to win anyways. You shouldn't rely on your opponents being bad. You have to, and as you get into the later rounds of the tournament, your opponents stop making elementary mistakes like that. It's not a reliable way to win. It's good enough for your locals, where people generally don't improve, but it's not good enough for a regional event like this. So we decided pretty quickly to cut Muzakaze. We also were somewhat reinforced by this decision because as we were discussing the choice, VG Paradox put out an article where they also suggested cutting Muzakaze because their opinion was that the discard half of the deck in the form of Rui and Seingeki was strong enough that you didn't need it. And I disagree on that part, but I do agree with them about Muzakaze being underwhelming. So we ended up not playing it, and that meant we didn't have much of a motivation to play the Forbidal package. Forbidal package was clogging up deck slots and increasing the number of brick draws for Shoujo Doji, which we settled on pretty quickly as being something we wanted to play. That meant that we just we had all these slots and nothing to put them in, and we decided the best card in the deck was the Restanders because the games that I was winning were the games where I would go second stride, 2 Restanders, 5 attacks with Crest bonuses. And we wanted to hit those games as consistently as possible. And sometimes I would lose a close game because I'd get to the late game and only draw 1 Restander. The other half of this is that with Unen being able to tuck a card into Soul and bounce 2 rear guards, you call Unen behind a Restander and bounce 2 rear guards, so you have an empty board, your opponent can't interact with it on their turn. But it meant you were getting rid of a Restander on your own. And you needed to do that to fuel the Soul cost. But that meant you wanted more Restanders in the deck to draw into, so you could go back-to-back Restand turns in case your opponent hit defensives and shut down your kill turn. With that, that really led us into wanting to play the 6 Restanders. We didn't want to play the Token Maker, though my teammate disagreed with me on this. He wanted to play the Token Maker. He thinks the deck card's very strong, and I agree it's very strong, but I found myself wanting the Soul and the plus card from Shoujo Doji and the ability to dig in the top 5 for a unit that you needed. That part is the underrated part of Shoujo Doji. People talk about the Soul generation. People talk about how he's a +1, but they don't talk about how he's essentially a check top 5 for any card in the deck that's a normal unit. And the fact that Unen bounces rear guards the hand means that anything that we find off of Shoujo Doji, if we have an Unen, we can call on the next turn or keep in hand for later. So frequently I would call Shiranui off of Shoujo Doji's effect and then bounce it to hand, or call Katari Kitsune and bounce it to hand. And that was an underrated way to keep the deck's consistency going up in a way that you might not realize when you're looking at Shoujo Doji just as a card by itself. It's a really strong combo and synergy. And that, I kept wanting to go back to that. Every time I cut him from the deck, I missed having that effect in the deck. So that combined with the 6 Restanders meant we just had too many grade 2s to play the Token Maker for the ratios in our deck. Just wasn't gonna there wasn't gonna be room for it. And the other factor that made me not want to play the Token Maker was Counterblast Control. I found myself dying to aggressive decks and to decks like Grand Blue a lot. Decks that could counterplay our combo and made the game go long, and decks that could just overwhelm us early. Those decks proved to be a significant challenge for Shiranui. And one of the ways I was able to increase my win rate in those matches was by purposely staying very low on my damage early. Because the nature of premium means that the longer the game goes on, the more unwinnable the game gets defensively. Lots of decks have ways to scale their power so high that you can't possibly guard everything. Lots of decks have ways to put you in a situation where you can't guard, or just have ways to simply overwhelm you with raw number of attacks. And the only way to survive those situations is to be at low enough damage that you have the maximum number of chances to hit defenses and get out of the situation alive. And because the numbers generally go up the longer the game goes on, I frequently discovered that there are no situations in the late game where you can guard with 1 card. almost everything ends up being a 2-card guard in good meta decks or in decks that we found problems with. So I frequently found myself losing more cards, being forced to guard late game because I've been pushed up damage, than if I just simply discarded one card to guard their grade 1 attack or their grade 2 attack. That meant I didn't have early CB for Yamashibuki. Regardless of whether I was playing counter charges or not, there was no damage in my damage zone. So that made me move away from valuing the card. My teammate countered back saying that Yamashibuki helps you guard early to make up for it by giving you the 2 evil decoys. But if you guard with the evil decoys, you can't go into Jakumeso, which is the strength of Yamashibuki in the first place. So there's no way around going into the counterblast cost for Yamashibuki and still having to invest resources. Either you're going to have to pay 2 CB to use those decoys to guard, and then you'll have to take an additional damage, or you'll use 1 CB and not get to use those tokens to protect yourself. I still think Yamashibuki is very good, and it is worth considering over Shoujo Doji if you are very good at soul management. If you aren't going to play 6 restanders, it's obviously the best choice. But if you are going to play 6 restanders, you simply can't afford the missing soul. In games where I didn't red Shoujo Doji, soul was okay, but I needed to then hit Unin for sure, or the draw crit that goes in the soul from the history collection. You can afford to miss out on one of these things, but you can't afford to miss out on all of them. And so Shoujo Doji gave us one more thing that we could hit in order to hit everything. That being said, lots of people disagreed with me. I'm sure some of you watching this will disagree with my deck choices. And I'll try to go into more detail again as we actually look at the list. The other thing I disagreed with the London list was the opinion that Jakumeso was necessary. It does help in some of the problem matchups for this deck, but I found that you could beat those matchups without it by simply playing differently. And I found myself rarely wanting to go into Jakumeso in other matchups because second Rine or first Rine is usually better. And that advances the deck's game plan more, gives you more dominate attacks to make the restanders better. And Jakumeso gives you 5 attacks, but if you have 6 restanders, you already have 5 attacks on any stride. And I found that the other strides had more useful effects than Jakumeso in terms of devastating our opponent's hand. That being said, specifically for Mega Colony and for Link Joker, I would wish I had Jakumeso, but I was able to beat Link Joker without Jakumeso, so I'm fine there. And Mega Colony is a close matchup that more comes down to how many times you can re-ride than it does anything else. And while Jakumeso does give you a way to multi-attack through their defensive options and through their stun effect, it's not necessary to win the matchup. And I also don't think Mega Colony is a very common deck right now. I didn't see any players the whole tournament, and not only did I pair up against no players, I saw no people on the deck. So they probably were some, but there weren't very many. As I looked around the tables, I didn't see people playing it. So I wouldn't worry about that. The only stride I'm really concerned about was the GB8 guy. He ended up coming up one game, and he wasn't very good. I don't know what I would put in that spot besides it, but I'll think of something later, and he's probably fine in that spot, to be honest, for now. I also mean no disrespect to any of the people who did play the London list, even though I've disagreed with many of your card choices. It said that our testing found them to be bad or incorrect. All of you are obviously very skilled players, and a lot of your choices make sense on that list, given the fact that they played so few of the restander. Once you make one of the choices in the deck construction for those decks, the rest of the deck choices follow suit and mesh with the synergy of that plan. Once we realized we wanted 6 restanders, and we didn't want guard restrict, likewise our deck choices follow from that plan and are consistent with it. With that, let's get into the actual deck. This is our starter, Midori. You have to play this in order to use the Crest. You don't have any other options, but thankfully it also looks cool. Move this to the side. This is our main grade 3 ride target, Shiranui of Oro, playing 4 copies. If you go first and you do not draw this card, you are in a very uncomfortable position. Missing out on history collection stride is a death sentence, and many times you have to go into it again later. Anyways, And you'll just be delaying your turns by one in order to do the same strategy. You can sometimes use G Guardians to go straight to Rene without ever getting protect markers, but I did that once in the tournament and it felt really bad, but I still won. So it's not the end of the world, but you are in a bad position if you don't ride this guy. And rewriting into him is like another good way to build soul to help with the soul management of 6 restanders. So we play 4. Next is 2 Zonky. This is the only other good legal ride target that you can go into after the Crest. He's been eroded to be a blazing demon stealth dragon, so he synergizes with some of the other cards in the deck. He's a very good late game card. On place and on stride, you get to dominate, so on the turn you ride into him, you'll get 2 dominates, which is very potent, especially if you go into Rene, because the second dominate will have the 10k and the crit if you've gone into History Collection the turn before. The other factor is that on the turn that you start with him in play, you'll Soul Blast 1 and you will draw a card and both players will call, which is effectively a discard 1 for your opponent, and their abilities won't activate, so they can't call an interactive card to do anything. You will just be minusing a card from their hand. If they call Hanali, you'll be a little panicky, but you have ways to deal with Hanali, as we'll see later. You also don't use a lot of CB in this build of the deck, so oftentimes I would get Hanali'd and would just pay for the cost, and it didn't do anything to me. Oh, here we got the cat again. He's going to interfere in this video a lot. Say hi to the camera, Maple. Oh, jeez. So, this is a critical card for the deck. Improves your Mega Colony matchup, giving you 2 more additional ride targets. Gives you additional dominate attacks. Gives you discard in the late game to even further oppress your opponent's hand. Looks very cool. Is another way to get dominate targets when your opponent clears their board because it forces them to call. Just overall, we're very happy to play this card, and we don't want any more than 2 copies. You could consider going 3 and 3 with these. I don't recommend it because a Boros is the only card you can go into History Collection stride with. So I just recommend 2 of these in the late game. And don't feel bad if you have to pitch them to stride or anything. He's not essential to our game plan. He's just a strong support card for our game plan. Next is our other grade 3 2V Shiranui. I at one point had 0 copies of this in the deck. I originally thought of them as only good with Forbidal as like another target to call with a different name, and I didn't think of this card as very strong. But the more I played with it, the more I realized it's a very solid card. On the History Collection turn, it's a 27k attacker, which is a very good number. Against non-force decks, they will be forced to 2 card guard this. If they went second, they will be forced to 2 card guard it anyway. The bounce and discard helps against Katrina because you bounce a token and force them to discard a card, and so they -1 for no reason. The fact that you can choose nothing and just put him into Soul to draw a card is good. He provides Soul for restanders on future turns, and putting him into Soul and leaving him there and choosing to Soul Blast other cards will telegraph to your opponent that you have Mizukaze and are saving it for a future turn, but you don't play Mizukaze in this list, and your opponent will make mistakes thinking you have it, but it's not even a card that's in your deck. I don't know if Vanguard has rules like Yu-Gi-Oh! I would never tell your opponent about Mizukaze in order to avoid that. Just be honest. Don't ever lie about it. Never be dishonest with your opponent. But it's not your fault if your opponent draws incorrect conclusions about cards that are in your deck. And in an open deckless format, it doesn't matter either. So on BRO, this won't be important. This is our main grade 2 ride target, Shoujo Doji. The card from Standard. If you've been playing Shiranui in Standard, you're very familiar with this card. This is just a very solid utility option. It's a base 10k, which also helps sometimes with early rush, so we're perfectly fine calling him as a grade 2 attacker on turns 2 and 3. But his effect is that you look at the top 5 when you ride him, you pick 2 stealth normal units, one of them goes to Soul. The first one has to go to Soul, which is very important if you only hit 1 target. And then you call 1 stealth normal unit. Generally, you're putting extra copies of himself and Seizui into Soul, the Crest Maker. This is a good way to filter dead cards out of the deck, while also generating Soul for later. And the call from top 5 means usually you'll find something that you need to make your hand complete. He just generally smooths out the deck's functionality. He's not that inconsistent to go into because we're playing Seiyangeki, so if you have multiple Seiyangekis, it's fine to discard one to try to find a Shoujo Doji. Uh, in general, we're not too sad if we brick on him and draw him late game because at the end of the day, he's a 10k card, 5k shield. He's an average card. Yeah, putting a Crest power on him will make him threatening, so no card is truly dead in a Crest deck. Tucking him into Soul with Unen will be a great way to smooth your Soul into the late game. Just overall a solid card, and the Token Maker is more resource intensive, whereas this is resource generating. That's the main difference between the two ride targets. Overall, I kept coming back to this card and liking it, and I kept enjoying the fact that it gave me more outs to go into 5 attacks 2 turns in a row. Next is one of the best cards in the deck, 4 copies of Seiyangeki. This is the promo for V. This effect lets you discard it at the beginning of ride phase to check the top 5 and pick a grade 1 or 2 card in the early game. This helps you find the Crest. This helps you find combo pieces like Unen to build up Soul. This helps you find Restanders in order to build up a hand for the late game. This lets you find Katari Kitsune in order to discard it and search for Shiranui Boro. This finds Honoli. This does everything you need it to do. On top of that, on top of being a great utility card for finding pieces, it's also an excellent early game attacker. You call this in front of a booster, and when boosted, you Soul Blast 1, your opponent discards a card if they have 4 or more, which is almost all the time. This is one of the ways you trick opponents into discarding Quick Shield or Guardian Shield, because they think, oh, I need to discard a card, but I need all these pieces in my hand to do my stuff, so I'll discard the Quick Shield. Surely that won't be important. And then you will punish them for that decision later with Rene. This is the bad player destroyer. This is also good against good players, though, because it just reduces their options by 1. And the soul cost isn't too bad if you're calling him in front of an Unen, and you're also fine with losing him after using Unen's effect to tuck him into Soul, because in the late game you want Restanders in the front row anyways. This card is frequently targeted by my opponents in the mirror match. They try to kill it when it's in play to get rid of it because they're afraid of it, not thinking about the Restanders. So it draws aggro from them. It hits okay numbers. It's a 9k, which is in premium is better than you would think because there's a lot of decks that are on 9k. Overall, just a decent card. Offensively, an excellent card for filtering, and we're extremely happy to have it in the deck and to play 4 copies. This card single-handedly makes the Crest build, I think, better than all non-Crest variants of the deck. I think it is mandatory to play the Crest and 4 of this in your Shiranui decks. I don't take arguments about non-Crest builds being better very seriously. There is some merit to the utility package that used to be in the old builds of this, but generally stealing the opponent's effects isn't very good. Most of the time you can't pay the cost of the effects or they're on play, so you don't get them anyways. But the 5k from the Crest is really important. It makes your Rene numbers much better. It makes non-hitting dominate targets hit. Overall, this card is better. Playing the Crest is better. Please play the Crest. Do yourself a favor. If you can afford to get Seizui's. If you can't get Seizui's, I'm really sorry. I know it's a very expensive card right now. It's very difficult to get your hands on some. Try asking your friends that bought the Shiranui deck for Standard if you can borrow theirs, if you plan on going to a big tournament and want to play this deck. Hopefully they'll help you out. I was fortunate in that even though the card spiked, my local store had multiple copies of the deck left over, so after I waited and everyone I knew who wanted to buy the deck bought it, I bought additional decks. Next is our main attackers. We have 4 Stealth Dragon Furai. Important that there is a Furai in V, I believe, that is playable as a ride target in this deck. So if you play that, you need to make sure that you're not playing the maximum copies of this, because they will count as the same name. And we were playing 2 copies of Stealth Dragon Sekiye. This was another source of debate between me and my test partner. Ultimately, I was persuaded by him. He thinks that Furai is better than Sekiye, and I'll give the arguments for both in case you don't agree with either of us. Furai is the more aggressive of the cards. It hits the bigger numbers. It also hits the better number on the first Stride History Collection because it'll attack for 20k, and if you're going first, means that it'll hit through a defensive trigger. It also has some late game scaling potential where you can get 2 or 3 or 4 dominate attacks in one turn. and then it'll go up by 20k power plus whatever your crest is giving it, making it very potent in the mid to late game. If you play Mugen Lord in your variant, Mugen Lord can dominate anywhere from 4 to 9 cards in the same turn, and this will then become a 50k attacker potentially without any crest bonuses. Overall, just a solid card, just demands shield from the opponent, and you want to play 6 restanders in some combination, but you want to play this one early, so I chose to play 4 copies of it. This brings us to Sekie. The arguments for Sekie are that if your opponents are good, they're going to be playing around Rene and not giving you dominate targets by calling Quick Shield, Guardian Shield, or Protect markers, in which case the extra power from this card doesn't matter because you won't get the dominate attacks. And the 10k from this will matter then because you'll get it after defensives are hit, and this will hit before defensives on the first couple attacks because they haven't hit. This is like they can't possibly have a defensive trigger on the first attack of a turn. Also, the card draw helps you survive on turns where your opponent does hit defensives and then get to another stride to kill your opponent. However, this doesn't get the power and the draw on the history collection turn. It only works on the first Rene turn. So overall, it's a bit more of a later game card. It's not as good early, but it can smooth your games out into the late game. It can help you draw into stuff in order to survive or draw into stride fodder for the next turn. My theory originally was that the games were won on the second Rene, and the card that gets us to second Rene more consistently is the better card, but I now believe that pressuring our opponent makes the first Rene more likely to kill. So I now play 2 copies of this, 4 copies of this. You could play 3-3, or you could play 4 of this and 2 of the other. I wouldn't play more than 6, and I wouldn't play less than 5 in this variant of the deck. This brings us to the most important card of the new build, the Crest Maker, Grade 1 Stealth Dragon Seizui. You gotta get this. Hard mulligan for it. Mulligan Grade 1s that aren't this card out of your hand so that you can G-assist to find this card. I strongly believe that you need to go all in on getting the Crest every game. And if you do, you'll find that you're far more likely to get it than you think. This and Seiyangeki make getting this pretty likely. I keep only a Boro. Sometimes I'll keep a Boro Shoujo Doji and mulligan everything else. I will keep copies of Seiyangeki, obviously, because those are extra chances of finding Seizui. I put back all restanders, I put back all triggers, I put back even heal triggers, even in matchups where I need to G-Guardian. I put back Hanali's, I put back anything that isn't this card, because this card is the most important thing to our game plan. And I was rewarded by only bricking on Crest once in the entire tournament. And in test games, I almost never brick on this. This is our next most important Grade 1. This is Unen. This used to be the best ride target for Nubatama, and it's still the second best ride target now that the Crest is out. When you ride this, you Soul Blast 1 to reveal a Grade 3 normal unit, and you search for a Grade 3 card with a different name. Not a Grade 3 normal unit with a different name. So if you're playing Forbidal, this can find the Forbidal, if I remember correctly, and then you can use that to plus. You can also find Mizukaze if you're playing that, but we're not, so this effect is not very good. We generally can only find V Shiranui or Zonki, revealing in a Boro for the cost. If you do use this effect, you get to put back a heal trigger or an over trigger or whatever, which helps your trigger count, but generally you want this for its other effect, the boosting effect. When this boosts, you put the boosted unit into Soul at the end of battle, and then you bounce 2 rear guards. This lets you do things like call restanders that you want to save for later in early rush, because you're going to bounce them anyways and protect them. This lets you have a booster for Seiyangeki, and then bounce your other rear guard call. This lets you call things with Shoujo Doji. I've mentioned this before. You call something with Shoujo Doji that you want in your hand, like Shiranui Oboro, and then you bounce it to hand with Unen. You can call a heal trigger. I think, actually, you can't call a heal trigger. You could call it heal trigger from hand and then bounce it, but you can't call it off Shoujo Doji, to clarify. Anything in your hand that is power, you can call and bounce this. You can call triggers to boost with and then bounce them with this. It lets you just be a bit more aggressive without exposing any cards from your hand and without giving your opponent the opportunity to damage deny you. Very solid card. 10k shield matters a lot too. Because we're playing these, you often discard these to guard with because you just need to stay alive. And it's not the end of the world if you don't use Unen, but you should use it at least once a game in order to keep the soul costs for your 3 standers on hand. Next is our other stealth grade 1. This is Katargitsune. I'm playing the... Oh. Just a moment. I am playing the overdress variant of this card. The overdress variant is, in my opinion, the best of the three. And that is a controversial opinion, I know. The G version lets you reveal a grade 3 and discard a card to search for a Boro, but generally the only grade 3s you have are going to be Boros or Zonkis. And so it didn't help me. This is also Stride Fodder just like that one. It's still Stride Fodder even if you brick on Crest. Finding a Boro or Zonky, whichever one is better, is also really nice. Because it searches for Demon Stealth Dragon. That's important to remember. But you have to have the Crest. If you don't have Crest, this can't search. That's where people get scared about this card. But as I mentioned, getting the Crest is very consistent. And even if you don't get Crest, you just pitch this to Stride and it's fine. Overall, I wanted the reliability of a hard search effect over anything else. I tried Tobitachi. I didn't like that I had to pay resources, and then if I bricked, I was screwed. And even if I hit, sometimes paying that resource made me lose the game later. So I didn't like that card. It is hypothetically the next best option, but we're also playing very few targets for Tobitachi, so the whiff chance is very high. Same argument for V Katargitsune. The whiff chance is very high because you only have 6 good ride targets in your whole deck. Some decks are playing 8 grade 3s that they're happy to ride into. We're only playing 6. The odds are a little bit worse in our favor, and we're not playing token makers in this build, so V Katargitsune isn't as powerful. So that made me keep coming back to this. I just wanted to hard mulligan for Crest, and then have the best chance of getting a Boro after that, and I felt that any game where I did those two things was a game that I could win. Next is our last of the normal units. This is Hanali. You must play this card at least as a 1 of, preferably as a 2 of, and if you're very scared of Excel, possibly as a 3 of. Personally, 2 has been fine. You can search for it with Sangeki if you have to, if you're in a matchup where you need it. You can leave this in play against many Excel decks because they don't have a way to kill it, and if they do, you just remove it. You need this against the mirror match, but it's not the end of the world if you don't get it in the mirror match. But it does make them work hard to kill it versus you just having passive protection. I will try to leave this in play as much as possible until I'm ready to kill my opponent. Otherwise, if I know my opponent has a way to interact with my board, I always remove it. This is just a really powerful effect. The errata helps it a lot. You're really happy to see this in the matches where you need it. In the matches where you don't, you just pitch it because it's 10k shield now. I believe it's been errated. And if not, you just pitch it to a protect marker. So overall, a decent card. And when I don't know the matchup very well, I like to just remove it from play, just as a YOLO, see if they actually can multi-attack me if I don't know what their deck does. Overall, this saved me a couple times. My first match against Neonectar, they were playing Musketeers, and Hanali denied them 1 attack, and that 1 attack allowed me to stride because I was able to keep cards in hand. So this was already a lifesaver, and it forced my opponents into misplays a lot in the mirror match because I would play it and remove it, and they'd be like, well, I can't go for this plan now. Overall, just a great card. 3 copies is the maximum I would play. I would not go to 4, but 2 is probably correct. One more thing about Hanali, actually, before I go to the next card. We did consider cutting this card entirely at one point. At one point, we were so deep in the hole that we were like, what if we just say that the matchups where we need Hanali are just unwinnable? And we just give up on defending ourselves in that case, and we just try to beat everything else. And play 0 Hanalis and just maximize our decked power. But ultimately, with this build, we found we had plenty of slots. And I would consider cutting the Hanalis entirely and playing a build that's exactly like this, but then maybe has the Forbidal package as well. But ultimately, like, I got softer and softer on the Guard Restrict package the longer I played this deck. So as I felt less desire to try to fit in room for everything, Hanali got more and more attractive. Last is Elementaria. This is the Blitz Order PG. Mandatory card to beat Oracle Think Tank. Gets you out of a lot of bad situations. It's a 1-card guard for any attack too. It's very strong. Very good card. Essential staple for premium format. Play this card. Next is our trigger lineup, which is pretty standard, so I'll try to blaze through it. This is the draw trigger from the History Collection errata. Very good in this deck because it generates soul as well, so it helps you fuel restanders, helps you dig into your deck to find restanders as well if you don't have any. Just excellent card in general. The 5k to the Vanguard does matter on the History Collection turn 2. Play 4 of this. Don't play Crit Sentinels. This is better. Next is our heals. I'm playing 3 of the grade 3 heals, 1 copy of this heal. This is the Countercharge Soul Charge heal. Basara, if you need to look it up. This is generally not super critical, and occasionally you'll draw this and not have a grade 3 heal to use for the plus 10k or minus 2 crit effect to protect yourself early, and you'll feel sad, but generally you want the Soul Charge effect from this. I don't, this will either let you take it damage, and then reuse that damage after G-Guardianing with it, or it'll let you G-Guardian with Moray Lord and then turn the damage face up so that you still have 2 Counterblast to go into Sukamorikan. That comes up occasionally, but because we're not playing Yamishibuki, we don't have any use for Counterblast aside from Rine and Sukamorikan. So usually you want the Soul Charge to make sure you have enough restanders. Overall, I'm happy to play 1 of this. If you don't like this, just play 4 of this. It's fine. Not the most critical deck choice, but I thought I'd talk about it a little bit. Draw PGs. We play 3 because we're playing an Elementaria. You want perfect cards. You play, like, perfect cards make your dead cards slightly better. When you draw Seizui, Shoujodoji late game, you just ditch them to perfect cards and you're fine. Next is the Stride crits. You play 4 because going into Stride is really powerful and they're 15k shield. And then last, the Dragon Empire Overtrigger. You must play this Overtrigger. There is no Overtrigger better than it for this deck. This gives you the highest power ceiling because all of your restanders from the Stride deck set from Standard are not once per turn. They are when your Vanguard attacks. So normally they're once per turn, but if you get this, you open up the number of attacks in the deck tremendously. You're going, let's say you go Rine, call to, on Stride Dominate. Okay, the maximum number, ride Zonky, on place Dominate. Call Stride Rine, on Stride Dominate, that's 2. Then you're going into activate Rine. Then they're going to call 2 cards from hand and Dominate. You've done 4 attacks. Then you go Restander, 6 attacks. Vanguard, 7 attacks. Stand, hit the Overtrigger, restand your Vanguard. Swing, that's 9 attacks. 10 attacks, 11, 12 attacks. 12 attacks is the maximum ceiling with Dragon Empire Overtrigger. If you ever hit that, your opponent's probably dead because you're also putting 100 million on a restander. They're going to have to guard 100 million twice. It's really good. Anytime your opponent hits this against you in the mirror's over, as I discovered the hard way. Just a very strong card. If you play Jakumeso is also not once per turn. So if you have the token maker guy and play an extra counterblast, you can do Jakumeso's full effect twice. And that's the other highest power ceiling turn the deck can possibly generate. I didn't play Jakumeso. I did have my opponent do that to me once, though, in tournament. And that's how I lost to the mirror match in Swiss the first time. Let's go into the G zone. We got our Crest. We've got our Protect markers. There's hypothetically some matchups where you are going to want to go into Protect 2. So I'll just talk about that real quick. Fenrir Control is going to damage an IU, so you'll want these to rush them harder. There are hypothetically some decks that can negate the effects of Sentinels that you maybe would want to go into this as a way to try to kill them before they get to their late game. I don't think that's a real concern. Aside from that, if a deck's not hard damage denying you and trying to deck you out with Mill, you're not going to use this. But you need to have 2 just in case that scenario comes up. You also only make 2 Protect markers in this deck ever, so you only need to carry 2 of each, but I carried 4 of each. The only time you can make more Protects than that is if you don't ride Crest, and then you go into V Shiranui on a later turn. But you can't ride into V Shiranui normally. Next for the tokens and stuff is Evil Decoys. Hypothetically, there's a scenario where you play the mirror match and you don't have Crest and you dominate their Yamishibuki and then you get the effect, so I would carry some of these on you. Your opponent will probably have some if you don't, but it's nice to have your own. Quick Shield, Guardian Shield, mandatory. Harmonic Messiah makes the Guardian Shield. This is really good in the Link Joker matchup too. Do not underestimate the effect of going into this card against Link Joker as a way to kill them out of nowhere. when they're not expecting it. Before we get to the GT Guardians, we'll go into the actual strides first. This is the History Collection stride. This is a very important card. This is what makes the deck's early game more threatening because you go into this on turn 3, and this is a big attacker, and it's making them discard, and it's offering you restands. Very, very good turn 3 with this deck. The discard is devastating. If you hit Dragon Empire over trigger with this, you get to make them discard twice. Just very good. Turns a card face up in the G zone, gives you protect markers to survive. Even if you break on grade 3 for turn, I often end up going into this anyways. And I go into this whether I'm going first or second almost every game. Next is our main stride. This is Rene. This is Plan A. Plan A is stride into Rene, make them discard 2 cards by forcing them to call those cards, and then dominate those cards and give them critical, because with the first ones that you get from the on-stride effect, they will be plus 14 and a crit usually. And then the Crest will make that plus 5 for 19. And then the second ones will be plus 20k overall after you add the Crest and the 5k from the call effect. So they'll be guarding a 19k plus. If you dominate a grade 3 that's already in play, that's a 20. That's a 32 with a crit that they have to guard. It's a 2-card guard. And then these are going to be 2 plus 20s. Those are going to be 2-card guards most of the time, unless they call triggers, in which case they have very little defensive value left in their hand. This is usually good enough to win the game on its own. Doing this twice is almost always good enough to win the game on its own. However, there are exceptions. Other Protect clans can generate so many markers in hand that you will never get the full attacks from this card. If their opponent is smart and they're holding onto their Quick Shield and Guardian Shield and prioritizing keeping these cards over other plays, they will also never get the full effect of this on the first time you use it. This makes those matchups so much more challenging and those players that do that much harder to beat. In order to play around that, the rest of the G zone has been constructed. Generally speaking, this is your primary stride. Against bad players, it will destroy them. Against good players with decks that aren't naturally good matchups, they will get destroyed as well. And in the late game, this card will overcome them anyways. But we play 4 because this is easily the best stride in Nubatama currently. Next is our utility strides. We go into Yatsuka Lord. This card is a bit of a weird choice because we're not playing the guard restrict, so we don't benefit from them calling stuff with this effect. However, the opponent will generally assume that we have guard restrict, and they will choose not to call stuff to play around it, which will benefit us because for every card they don't call, we will get 10k to the front row and draw a card. So you call 2 Restanders and activate this effect. They're going to sit for 2 minutes thinking about this really hard, wasting a lot of brain power, exhausting themselves, and then they're going to make the wrong choice. They're either going to be afraid of the cards you have and they'll call everything and they'll discard 3, which we are fine with, or they will call nothing and they will give us a gigantic front row and also give us a plus 3. Overall, decently strong card. It doesn't flip a card face up though, so we usually can't go into this early or we're handicapping our Crest power for the rest of the game. So you go into this when you have to. This is really good against decks that are good against Rene, because you can trick them into maybe discarding the markers if they call from the drop, and if they don't, then maybe you can force them to use those markers with the plus 30k that turn, or randomly just win the game because they can't guard your stuff anymore. Next up is Mukuro. I am not the biggest fan of this card. I play it because there's some scenarios where your other strides don't do anything and you just want to clear their board, or you're playing against Mega Colony and you didn't draw grade 3 to ride into, and so you're going to go into this simply to dominate their Vanguard and then draw 2 cards and hopefully dig. Overall, not the best card. It comes up sometimes. Sometimes your opponent has a really good card that negates your strategy in play and you need to kill it. My cat's clearly not a fan of Mukuro either. He came up here to slay him. Just, we had to fill the G-Zone slots, and this is like one of the least bad options. You can try D Mukuro. I don't recommend it because you need to discard specifically a card with the same name as a Boro, I think, is the requirement, and so it's much harder to pull off. You can also try like the Zero with Dragon in this spot, Drachma. Drachma will wipe their board, but will also kill your G zone for the rest of the game. So it's only viable as a late game option, or if you're very confident in your ability to win. Like the over trigger is already out and they're at 5. Next, we'll go into the Spice, the 2 Sukamura-Con. I saw someone from London had this second Sukamura-Con, and I agreed with that strongly. We were already leaning that way as well. I borrowed the second one from a friend, so this is a proxy for now. But this is the other best stride besides Rene, in my opinion. It's heavy on the cost, but as I mentioned, we're not playing the Yamashibukis, so 2 CB is actually quite easy for us to pay. We don't have any other use for Counterblast, especially since we're not going to Rene on the same turn as this. This card forces them to bind all but 4 cards in their hand, which is a very painful choice for them to make. It makes them overthink. It makes them make mistakes because they're panicking and stressing out over it. And it gets rid of Protect Markers and Quick Shields. If they bind those cards, they fizzle in the bind zone. They're only allowed to exist in the hand and Guardian Circle. And so this will make them over-prioritize those markers and thus keep a bad hand, or it'll make them undervalue them and they'll get rid of them and set you up to kill them next turn. Either way, if you go into this when they're at high damage with 2 Restanders, they're very likely to die. There is basically, unless they have an interactive G Guardian, there is no way statistically for them to survive 5 big attacks with late game Crest power from Restanders with only 4 cards in hand. Their only option at that point is to heal out of it, and sometimes not even that will save them. And so I strongly recommend playing the second Sukamura-Con, especially if decks like Grand Blue get popular, because one of the best ways to beat Grand Blue is just to go into Sukamura-Con twice in a row, instead of going into Rene even once. It'll discard more cards from their hand, it'll push them up damage really high, and oftentimes players won't be expecting the second one, and they think, well, now that we've survived one copy of this, that's over forever. So they won't be playing around it in the future. Do keep an eye out for the number of G Guardians your opponent has access to in their hand. If they have too many heal triggers in hand, they can survive this. So you might be better off going into something else to try to buy yourself a turn. Next is the GB8 Stride, Roku Shiki-Rakan. This guy is kind of a win more card. For going into him at GB8, you have at minimum plus 35 to your front row from your Crest, which means that they're probably dead. There's very few ways to survive that. But this will make sure that they're dead, I guess, is a way to look at it. It lets you spend any resource, Counterblast or Soul Blast, in order to make your opponent discard 2 cards when they place a card on Guardian Circle from hand. So, on plays Dominate, swing something they have to intercept with, like a grade 2, at their Vanguard, and then they will be forced to guard from hand and have to decide whether they want to lose 2 cards to stop this measly Dominate attack, or if they just want to take it. So this is very potent when they're at 5. If they're at 5 and you go into this, sometimes they're deterministically dead. There's no combination of cards they could guard with that will allow them to survive the turn unless they hit multiple heals. And so, overall, just a strong card. It does lose to Elementaria, it does lose to the heal triggers going into G Guardians, but a very, very solid late game finisher. Probably better than Drachma, if I'm being honest. So I played 1 copy of it. I went into it exactly once. It did win me the game, but it almost didn't win me the game because my opponent had multiple G Guardians. Next is our G Guardians. Only 4 of them in the deck. We're playing 2 Moray Lord. This is the good one. And then 1 of Gehorikan and 1 of this guy, Gando Kurukan. Moray Lord is just very big shield value. Counterblast 1, 5k for each card in their hand is absurd. Sometimes he's guarding for plus 50 shield or more. Basically a perfect guard at that point. And if they're low on cards, he draws a card, which means that he's not even bad at that scenario. This one is this card lets you take a grade 1 from their back row and move to Guardian Circle and dominate it. This is just like an okay card. Sometimes they attack with 1 column and you take the grade 1 boosting the other column and fizzle the rest of their turn because now they can't hit over your defensive trigger. It's very resource intensive. It's Counterblast, Soul Blast. So, you can't use this very much, so I only play 1 copy of it. I didn't go into this a single time the entire tournament. I went into Moray Lord and this guy the whole time. Then this is Gando Kurukan. This is a 30k shield if they've got 6 cards in hand, which is what it's there for. You go into this when you don't want to use the Counterblast for this or when you want to save one of these for later. You just go into this when 30k is good enough. Overall, like solid G Guardian. Uh, package for G Guardians is not very good in this. The only thing you could consider playing over this is Zashikihime. That one is the flips over another G Guardian, and then your opponent can choose whether to discard a card or not. And if they do, it gets a giant shield value. Or if they don't, it gets a big shield value. And if they do discard a card, it stays at like 15. That card's not very good, but the main reason you would play it is to flip over another G Guardian to build up Crest power and ambush your opponent with how much power your board is going to be next turn. So they think, oh, they have one shield trigger in hand. Their board will be plus 25. And instead you make it plus 30, and it throws off their math for what they could card with, and then they die. Overall, like, if I was going to do that, you could consider cutting this guy for it. You could consider cutting the Yatsuka Lord for it. I would not touch the number of Sukamorikons. The Mukuro is also a flex slot in the G zone, but I do end up liking this card a lot in certain matchups. This is also one of our only strides that doesn't cause counterblast, so I would not cut this. So it's really these two cards are the ones on the chopping block, and overall I think this one's slightly better than this one. The GB8 guy is just a little too niche, a little too late game in a deck that's already got an excellent late game. So if you were going to trim for 5th G Guardian, this is what should go, in my opinion. But I also don't think you should play 5G Guardians. I think you can, and it's fine, but I wouldn't do it myself personally, and obviously I didn't for this event. So that's the entire deck. Ultimately, I think our playstyle choices of how we guarded early moved us into this path and moved us towards surviving to the late game with Power of the Crest and Restanders. We realized you don't need all the other stuff the other lists are playing because you already have 2 reliable win cons. Either your Strides will get the job done or your Restanders and Crest will get the job done. And 2 plans is good enough for anybody. Well, generally speaking. Obviously, Grand Blue gets to have like 5. At the end of the day, this list proved to be very strong in the mirror specifically because I was more consistently able to go into a backbreaking turn. I was more consistently able to get the cards that I wanted, and I wasn't playing cards that were negated through counterplay like Mizukaze. So I had fewer dead cards. I had more consistent chances of getting my strong turns, and I also was prepared for what they were doing, but they were not prepared for what I was doing. And so that gave me a slight edge and allowed me to win all of my mirror matches, except for the 2 in Swiss where I lost to Overtrigger and G-assisting on 1 and whiffing, respectively. I think overall our build is better than the other builds than the list from London. I know that's probably going to get questioned a lot and challenged a lot, but I think the Guard Restrict and Forbidal packages are crutch. I think that they make the deck easier to play, but not better. It's too easy to fixate on this card as like a free win card, just a thing you play and then your opponent's dead because there's no way they can beat the Guard Restrict, right? And it takes away the tendency to think of how your opponent's counterplaying against your deck. It reduces your ability to think about how your deck actually wins. And instead, this version of the deck, while it doesn't have access to the free wins from Guard Restrict, it doesn't need them, and as long as you play better than your opponents, you don't need the crutch. The Crest is the crutch now. The Crest gives you an unbeatable late game if you get to it. Simply nothing can survive plus 40k to the front row, and stride attacks, and restanding. So overall, I would compare this to the guy who played Oracle Think Tank without Amaterasu in his list from last year. Not Maxime Solemn, but the other Maxime from Europe. And he said that basically that you didn't need it to combo kill your opponent. And this is a similar philosophy. We don't need the Guard Restrict to combo kill our opponent. We just need to play good solid Vanguard and get to the late game. And our strides are so powerful that they'll get the job done for us. If your opponents are bad and aren't holding on to markers in hand and don't understand how Mizukaze works, that card's going to be stronger. But the better the caliber of player you go up against, the less effective those cards will get. And so you'll find yourself uh, holding on to this combo and just losing the game because good players just don't fall for it. And instead, you could have just been playing more restanders and had a better chance of winning the game through the fair route. And that's what we went for. We also found that some of the deck's worst matchups also didn't care about the guard restrict, and our way to beating those bad matchups, things like Katrina, things like Mukuro or not Mukuro, Murakumo. Those matchups, the best way you could win is just to spam as many attacks as possible and hope your opponent dies, or hope you hit triggers and your opponent dies, or hope they don't hit defensives. And having the most number of rearguard attacks was the best way to do that. The big weakness of Shiranui before this Stride deck set was that the rearguard attacks were bad. Now we have excellent rearguard attacks. And so I decided to just play this variant. And it was very rewarding to play. It worked through the whole tournament. Never once did I lose because of my deck choices. Never once did I have a game where I wished I had guard restrict. Never once did I have a game where my opponent's build was just better suited for the matchup than mine. I think if you lean into the Crest and focus on maximizing the Crest's power, that is the best way to play this deck going forward. I know another thing I'll comment on the strategy for this deck is that the player from London who got fourth, I believe, said that in the mirror match he liked to not dominate, or he liked to not ride the Crest, so that he could steal the abilities of the mirror match. And I understand the philosophy there, and I'll try to be as respectful about this as possible. I disagree with it, even though I understand it, because I think it's a misevaluation of how this matchup and how Vanguard and Premium in general goes. Vanguard is not really a game about resource management, at least in its current stage. Vanguard is a game about tempo. Vanguard is a game about entering the mid and late game in the best position and then taking advantage of that position to kill your opponent. Because most strides either plus so many resources that you can never run your opponent out, or they have some kind of unbeatable situation once they build up enough to fill their costs. Like, for instance, Oracle Think Tank puts you in an unguardable situation with extra crit and you die. Highlander throws 9 attacks at you with a million force markers in play. There's no way you can survive that once they go into the second Helltrauda. Things like that. And so trying to play this grindy resource game didn't really work. You just get destroyed by the raw power of other decks. And this deck doesn't have the most raw power. So the best way to win, in my opinion, in the mirror match and in premium in general, was just to have the most aggression, to have the most tempo, and to disrupt our opponent along the way, to set them back a turn or to put us up a turn by squeezing their hand, by forcing them into uncomfortable guard situations. And having the most attacks did that. Having more attacks is like having more discard, essentially. And so I was winning both the resource game and the tempo game with this build, because on my history collection turn, I was calling a restander and doing 4 attacks with a Furai and usually a V-Shiranui in the other column. And my opponent was just forced to dump a ton of cards to not go up high damage, or they were forced to go up to high damage and then they were dead on my Rene. I just generally don't value playing the card advantage game in that way unless you also have pressure to back it up. And this deck has more pressure to back it up. And so I wanted the Crest, especially if I was going first, just to leverage that, just to make it so that the longer the game went on, the more my opponent was dead, no matter how well they managed their resources. And in the mirror match, if both players ride into the Crest, it does end up becoming a question of who's better at guarding, who drew better aggression, who hit more triggers. And I don't think that going into using Yamashibuki to protect your stuff and bounce stuff really solves that mirror match problem. My opponents all tried to do something like that against me. They tried protecting the rear guards with Yamashibuki, and they tried... one person did try not riding the Crest on me to do that, and because I wasn't on the same plan, it didn't work for them. And ultimately, the two players that didn't ride Crest against me, one didn't ride it in Swiss, and one didn't ride it in top eight, were just in a much weaker position overall because they had to dump so many more cards from hand to guard when I didn't do that. And the one guy in Swiss who I lost to, who didn't ride Crest, hit over trigger, and if he hadn't hit over trigger, he was at 5 damage, and I had another Sukumoricon in my G zone ready to go with 2 face-up damage on my side. So all I had to do was not get over triggered, and he was deterministically dead on my turn. But unfortunately, he did over trigger me, and I died. That way, which is part of the game. You can't get mad about it. And he was actually a really cool guy. We talked. I joked that he needed to make top 8 so I could get my revenge, and he did. So in my opinion, the builds from London were making erroneous assumptions about how this deck actually functions, but their choices weren't completely wrong in some ways. And I have considered going back to the token maker over Shoujo Doji and just trying to see if I can make the soul management work better with more practice, and possibly with like a single copy of Forktail or a single copy of Kagemichi, I think is the card from Shoujo Doji that puts a stealth card from dropping a soul. And if I tried those builds again, I bet I could see if that would work with the token maker, especially since those on-play specs would synergize with the bounce. And then maybe I could replace the GB8 guy with the Jakumeso, and then the deck would be better, perhaps. But I do really like having the privilege of not guarding, or of guarding stuff early and not taking damage. And that felt really strong, and it feels like a really good way to beat aggro decks, because they're sort of expecting you to take these early hits in order to fuel your own costs. But I don't have any of those costs. Every time someone tried to rush me down and I guarded everything, I was never punished for it. And then every time someone tried to damage deny me, it didn't matter. So overall, I think if I played this deck in a tournament again, I would probably play the exact same thing, even with those considerations I mentioned. And again, even though I disagree with the other lists heavily, I have a lot of respect for the players that took them to great success. And I want to emphasize that getting top at a BSF is still a great accomplishment. And that summarizes, I think, everything I wanted to say. If anybody has any questions about how our testing led to this, or the card choices, or combos or synergies that I forgot to mention, please leave them in the comments. I'll try my best to check frequently and answer them. I do want to develop the meta for this deck a lot, because I think this deck has a lot of untapped potential. I know that even though I agonized for this list over a month, almost 2 months, I think, of solid testing and deck building, I still feel like we haven't learned everything there is to know about Shiranui and Premium. Even after we got back to the hotel from the tournament, my teammate who helped me test this list was like, what if we played Forbidal just for value? What if we played Forbidal just to find V Shiranuis and like a single copy of Irina, just to have a +1 card in our deck? And I thought, maybe that would actually be pretty good. And if that's the case, then maybe the answer is that Mizukaze is still bad, but that Forbidal is still worth playing just to generate value. And I will probably be testing that variant of the deck next in my private testing sessions. But if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm sorry if I rambled or got disorganized, and I apologize if the cat made things difficult to follow because he was a distraction. But I hope to see you all in the future at BSF events and BCS events. I know I want to keep competing. I want to see if I can get another top this season or next season. And I plan on putting up more Vanguard videos on this channel in the future, so keep an eye out for that. Subscribe if that is your thing. I also have some fighting game content on here. I'm not very good at fighting games, but maybe I'll be funny to watch. Thank you, and have a good one.